Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. A little bit later, Jeremy Dys will be with us as well. But we're going to spend some time in this first segment or so talking about the El Paso Manifesto. A couple of reasons for that. First of all, very good piece that we have posted by Byron York that appeared in the Washington Examiner. And then Dr. Merrill Matthews, who with a tremendous amount of fortitude has actually taken the time to read through the manifesto. And I think it puts a lie to even some of the comments being made by the media. And even one of the callers the other day said, you know, you're just dancing around the issue. The issue is Donald Trump is due to this. And interestingly enough, this shooter in El Paso made a point of even saying that I thought of these ideas and held these ideas long before there was a Donald Trump. And frankly, there are going to be people that are going to try to tie me to Trump or white supremacy. That's not really what this manifesto is all about. So let me just mention that this has turned into a crazy time. We'll get into this a little bit later. But you have a man in Springfield, Missouri, walks in with, and I'm laughing, but it's not funny, really, with body armor, military fatigues, carrying tactical weapons and 100 rounds. And, of course, there's a fireman that kind of disarms him, but he's trying to make a point, obviously, that I can walk around with all of this stuff and you can't do anything to me. Well, and it will be interesting to see what they charge him with. Then there's a Florida man that ran into trouble. And he went into Walmart, asked a clerk for anything that would kill 200 people. And again, these are people trying to make a point. A word to the listeners out there, this is not a good strategy to use, even though you may be trying to make a point about, quote, how easy it is to buy a weapon, which is not true, or the freedom that you have to walk around with military camouflage, body armor, and fatigues and tactical weapons. This has just shown how crazy it's gotten. But anyway, Dr. Merrill Matthews, I'd love to get your thoughts because we've had multiple shootings and at the same time, even some more threats even today.
Yes, and in fact, it's a tragic week. I mean, we talk about all the things we have to talk over on Fridays on these things. Yes. This one gives us some tragic things to deal with. But you know, I tell you, I'm as interested in how the media and others are responding to this, right? Because that's the narrative, apart from what the guy did and what his intentions were. Because I mentioned to my wife the other night, I said, you know, the guy who did the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, he supported Elizabeth Warren. He said, I could vote for Bernie, Elizabeth Warren. He's on the left, clearly on the left. And she said, really, I haven't heard anything about that.
Yes.
Amazing.
I said that on Monday, and I had people even around the studio say, it's the first time I've heard anything like that. Yeah.
They focus on the intent of the El Paso shooter. But as I was looking through his manifesto, and it's out there on the internet, so you can pull it down, if you were to just hand that to me out of any other context, and you said, what would you think of this person? I would say, well, it's a little bit mixed, but it looks to me like he's more on the left than the right.
Oh, sure.
And the reason is because his people comrades in there in one spot. But he's a very pro-environmental person, concerned about the environment, and very anti-corporation. Now, there are some Republicans and conservatives who are critical of corporations as well, but the anti-corporate, pro-environment thing sounds much more like it comes from the left than from the right. And so it's just his strong anti-immigrant, and especially Hispanic. But we'll just add, historically, liberals were oftentimes anti-immigrant because they felt like they were coming in and taking jobs, which is what the shooter was concerned about.
Also concerned about automation, sounds like Andrew Yang. Yep. When he's talking about corporations, sounds like Elizabeth Warren. When he's talking about the environment, sounds like Jay Inslee. Yeah. Those are all Democratic candidates, by the way, in case anybody has. And a lot of them aren't as well known as others. You do as well. But, you know, this is something that is kind of intriguing. Let's give Byron York his due, and that is he took the time to read it. And you get into about I think it's the fourth paragraph where he said, now, first to be clear, the manifesto is insane. Okay, there's a few things that are a little bit over the top. But frankly, let's try to give this shooter his due. He's worried about immigration. He's worried about automation. He's worried about job losses. He's talking about universal basic income. He's talking about oil drilling, urban sprawl, watersheds, plastic waste, paper waste, college debt. It frankly just looks like the kind of things you'd see on some of the web posts from various Democratic candidates.
That's exactly right. And I would have to argue that his train of thought and logic is better than some freshmen and sophomore college students I've had to grade their papers.
I was going to say, you've been a professor and seen that.
And even a few PhDs.
Yes.
And because typically if these things tend to ramble, they sort of go from one place to another, and just connecting all kinds of things that don't connect. He's got subheads here, and it follows. And you may disagree with him. There's some things but it's it seems to be a thought out, even if wrongly thought out, but a thought out thing that he put down and probably spent some time. I think I only found 1 or 2 typos in there. That's amazing for somebody who doesn't do this sort of on a living and a younger person. So I wouldn't call it insane. You might call what he did insane, but the document itself seems to me to be certainly premeditated, forethought, and given a lot of consideration from his standpoint.
Just for a little bit longer, and then we'll move on to some other topics. This particular article, first of all, that Byron York put together, talks about Brenton Tarrant. Mm-hmm. Now, we rarely mention the names of the shooters, but in this case, I just have to. This is the individual that shot and killed 51 individuals, murdered another 49 individuals in a mosque in New Zealand, and wrote a manifesto of his own, a 74-page manifesto called The Great Replacement. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, some of the first words in the manifesto, I believe, are where the shooter, the El Paso shooter, says, "In general, I support the Christ Church shooter and his manifesto." So some of this goes back to an individual that had been to France, saw how France was turning more Muslim, so brings that kind of bizarre view to New Zealand, and as a result decides that maybe the best way to eliminate some of this influx from the Muslims is to go into one of those places and kill them all off in a mosque. So in some respects, you can see the connection, not killing Muslims in this case, but killing Hispanics, because, again, this is this idea that we're losing our heritage, we're losing our kind of identity, and that's where, when the word invasion shows up, that's when they say, well, then that's Donald Trump. But the people that were influencing this El Paso shooter were actually, again, very liberal people, weren't they?
And he says in there, the Hispanic community was not his initial target. It was after reading The Great Replacement that he decided that. So this is this is not the normal pattern that I think you would see from a person who's doing this.
Yes. We're going to take a break, and I just thought I would mention that. And this article is on the website in terms of one of the very significant issues. And again, the title of it, you can find it in, of course, the Washington Examiner. It's by Byron York. Has anyone actually read the El Paso Manifesto? Well, I'm sitting across from somebody that has, and I guess maybe I'm going to have to now as well. But nevertheless, what I've been struck by, even by looking at the few pages that Byron York has put together, and you can print it out, it's about 4 pages long, gives you a pretty good summary, and it helps you understand that the media narrative was wrong. I know that shocks you. Well, we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, a generation ago, driving on American roads was much safer than in many other countries with lots of open roads, like Canada or Australia. That is not the case anymore. David Leonhardt reports that our vehicle fatality rate is about 40% higher than the fatality rates in Canada and Australia. He says he was unaware of this country's outlier status until he began to report on the rise of driverless cars. As you might imagine, many people are not convinced that driverless cars will be a good thing for Americans. They aren't convinced they should trust their lives to a computer. I understand that fear, but let's remind ourselves that the current state of driving in America is very dangerous for a number of reasons. First is the problem of speed. Many other countries have lower speed limits, despite the famous German Autobahn. Small differences in speed make a very big difference in potential harm. If we install speed cameras, speeding will decline. A second reason is seatbelts. I was shocked to learn that 1 in 7 American drivers do not use seatbelts. Who are these people? Every time you see a person get into a car on TV or in movies, they put on a seatbelt. Most cars beep at you if you don't put on a seatbelt. A third reason is age. In other countries, 16-year-olds are often not allowed to drive. As you might imagine, teenagers are responsible for a disproportionate number of accidents. Drinking before driving is another problem, especially since many people who drink don't consider buzz driving to actually be drunk driving. And don't forget that people distracted by cell phones often are as dangerous behind the wheel as people who are drunk. Add all these factors up and you can see why driving in America is more dangerous than driving in many other countries. It's time to change our bad habits. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. A little bit later, Jeremy Dys will join us. And, of course, we will be talking about lots of issues. One of those, we did post a very good summary of the El Paso Manifesto by Byron York. But one of the others that I posted here is by Tucker Carlson. And, first of all, this is going to get us into the number 8. Now, I had been oblivious to this other than the fact that I
you're
did
a late
mention...
bloomer, you just didn't know.
I guess I just didn't know, I guess. Either I'm just oblivious or I just not pay attention. I don't go to these websites, obviously. Neither do you, Dr. Matthews. No. But when the other day I said that the website 8chan was taken down, and that's where the El Paso shooter and others have gone, but they're part of 8 supremacists. That was good. Well, if you read through Tucker Carlson's piece, you have to get to what is about the 5th paragraph, where he points out that the president said we'll fly the flags at half-mast until August 8th. That's 8-8. Now, and you go, okay, what's wrong with 8-8? Well, the number 8 apparently is very significant because the 8th letter of the alphabet is H. 8. So if you have 8-8, that's HH, which stands for?
Heil Hitler.
Oh, my goodness. I got to watch how I use the number 8 now.
And this was apparently a commentator on MSNBC, wasn't it? I believe it was a commentator who goes through this, and he starts out by saying
MSNBC,
in there, I don't really... I don't really think Trump was meaning this, and then he goes into this.
And I go, what? What?
8-8, and
watch what you say about the number 8 now. I had no idea.
I have an even worse one.
Okay.
Kerby has 5 letters in it.
Uh-oh.
The 5th letter in the alphabet is E, and that starts Ava for Ava Braun, which was Hitler's
You're really
girlfriend.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
I just go ahead and fess up.
And are we losing our train of thought here? I mean, and are losing our minds as a country?
Our minds.
I can't believe this.
I can't even imagine somebody coming on national television and saying something like that. I mean, it's just, there's been people out there, we've talked about things that are interesting and kind of numerology and way different things. Jerusalem has USA in the middle of it. Oh, was that a prediction of the United States? Well, no, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But these things just become bizarre when people actually believe them, and the left has believed. Remember, I think it was Justice Kavanaugh's hearing where the lady sitting behind him clearly had darker skin. I mean, she wasn't African American, but she had a little bit darker skin, and she had a little OK sign on her hand, and the Twitter realm exploded with this is a white supremacist symbol, and then you go and look. She's the daughter of a Polish Jew, if I remember right, and a Mexican woman, She's giving a sign to the white supremacists because she's sitting there with her front finger and thumb touching each other. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, well, and again, this was always supposed to be a really good article because the title of it by Tucker Carlson, and we've mentioned some of his other columns that he writes with Neil Patel. I think that's how you say his last name. Take a breath, America. It's still a decent country filled with decent people. But in the midst of that, uses that illustration, just say it is crazy, and it is getting crazier by the day. And there was another article we mentioned, I think it was last week, of an individual that says what's happening now reminds him a lot of 1972. A little bit later, we're going to talk about how the election of 2020 might remind us of 2004. But he was saying in 1972, there were people that he knew, because he's pretty much on the left and a Democrat, that were actually assuming that Richard Nixon was a wide-eyed conservative. I think you and I both know that wasn't the case. And it almost gave permission then to say, then we can get George McGovern because he'll be a wild kind of liberal, and we'll put the two together. He said the same kind of thing's happening here. As much as people like to say that Donald Trump is a wild conservative, he wasn't before. I'm not sure he is now, but it's given permission for the left, and especially the Democratic Party, to say, we're going to just try to out-left each other.
Yes.
And then the commentators are looking for tea leaves and finger-pointing and numerology to try to give any kind of analysis for what's going on.
And we seem to have lost any sense of discernment. That
you think?
that these things are fair game to discuss, but this stuff over here is just crazy.
Yeah.
And the media, I just have to say, keeps feeding this because of the way they respond. And they don't seem to understand how, and this may go back, they may just not understand how biased they are in their presentation, because they would say, I think, we're doing a good job of trying to explore what's happening in El Paso and this guy's background and so forth. But I think a large of that's because they immediately sort of latched onto the notion this guy's probably a conservative and a Trump supporter, so therefore let's go after him. But we'll leave the one in Dayton, Ohio, we'll leave him sort of in the background. We won't look at that nearly as closely.
Yes. And to just talk about the media for just a minute, because you've been looking at this as well. You know Peggy Waymeyer, and Peggy Waymeyer had a piece in the Dallas Morning News the other day in which she was, for anybody that doesn't know, she was the religion reporter first for WFAA and then, of course, for ABC. And she points out, and she was using the pro-life example, but I'm going to expand that in just a minute, that when she would try to do a pro-life story, there were people in the newsroom that say, are there really people that believe that? Yeah, a majority of people in America believe that. Oh, I don't know anybody that believes that, kind of thing. And it brought us back to another piece that I posted earlier in the week, in which there have been some studies that have been done, and Arthur Brooks talks about this, in which they have interviewed, for example, Democrats and asked them to tell them what they think a typical Republican is. And they found that the typical Democrat that they were doing interviews with believed that 40% of Republicans have an annual income of $250,000. By the way, in case you're wondering, that's 2%, not 40%.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not even in the right order of magnitude.
And that's 2% of the population, right?
Yeah, 2% of the Republicans, I think it was, or something like that. But anyway, the bottom line was it's just grossly inflated. And what they found is the more liberal you are, the more inaccurate your perceptions were. And a while back, we had Jonathan Haidt on, and we talked about his book, Coddling of the American Mind. But when he did this one book earlier on, he cited this study in The Righteous Mind, where they ask conservatives and liberals to answer a survey 3 times. First of all, answer it the way you would answer it. Then answer it the way you would think a conservative would answer it, and then answer it the way a liberal would answer it. So they kind of use this as a study. And what they concluded is conservatives and moderates were pretty accurate in terms of not only understanding what they believe, but what the liberals believe. The liberals were completely inaccurate, and the more liberal you are, the more, if you will, out of touch with reality was. Well, you pull all that together, given the fact that most newsrooms are pretty liberal, this is why there's nobody going, oh, wait a minute, I think that's a little bit crazy. You're saying something that I don't think most Americans believe in. And just the other day when the New York Times put out this one headline There was so much of a pushback, they had to change the headline in the New York Times.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, this is what's happening right now in the newsrooms in America.
And they don't seem to understand it. And Arthur Sulzberger from the New York Times had a piece in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, criticizing President Trump for some of the things he's saying about the New York Times, saying we're dedicated journalists, we're doing these things right. The president is sort of alienating this, and he was very critical of the president and the language he's using for attacking journalists and calling the New York Times treasonous in some of the things they have done. I don't know. The president might be right on that. I don't know. But at any rate, it's interesting how that you're getting that pushback, and they just don't even see it. They don't understand how liberal they are in doing this.
I'll add just one more to the conversation. We'll have some more after the break, and that is a while back, Charles Murray, who you know as well, put together a series of questions to determine whether or not you live in a bubble zone. In other words, how bubbly you are. And these were questions like, have you ever been in a pickup truck? You ever been to Walmart? And I know people in New York City that have never been in a Walmart, never driven a pickup truck, probably never shot a gun, and on and on and on and on. And they found, interestingly enough, that the bubbliest zip codes in the country were in New York, which is where all the mainstream media pretty much is, with the exception of CNN in Atlanta, or in Silicon Valley, which determines whether or not you're going to see things on the internet, or in Hollywood, which is going to determine what you see on television and the media.
Yeah.
So you have this bizarre situation where the media elite is so out of touch with the American people because they've never experienced some of the things the American people take for granted.
And that's why shows like this and a number of the talk shows that came out, conservative talk show, just took off after it really got going. And liberals couldn't even keep on the talk shows because average people out there who wanted to listen, they could only keep conservatives on the talk shows. Liberals people didn't support it. But it was an alternate source of information. Point of View's been doing that now for more than 45 years.
That's right. Well, let's take a break, and we will also, if you'd like to join us, take your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. I'll check our Facebook here because sometimes people like to leave some comments there, and we'll chat about that afterwards. But we'll be getting into a variety of other issues. I might just mention some of the other articles we posted. I just mentioned, will the 2020 election be a repeat of 2004? Can you see a doctor under Medicare for all? Dr. Merrill Matthews' piece. And Jeremy wrote one on Trump and religious liberty. So we'll get to those a little bit later, but all those on the website, and we'll be back right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us, and I did mention a couple of those articles. We'll get to those later. You know, can you see a doctor under Medicare for all is the second article we've posted. President Donald Trump and religious liberty. We'll be talking about that as well with Jeremy Dys, and also get an update. There are really some very significant cases since he's not here this hour. But will be with us in about a half an hour. We'll go through those, some very interesting things happening with the Kuntz cheerleaders, happening with the Master P. Well, I guess it's the other one, the Sweet Cakes case out of Oregon, and a couple of others, which we'll talk about. So lots of things that we will cover as we go to the national program in about a half an hour. But just before we finish off this hour, let me talk about something that Jim Garrity talked about the other day. There have been people, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that have wanted this article. It's very easy to find. It's a National Review. But I thought it was a great summary because what he said is sometimes we're guilty of shoehorning multiple causation shootings into a single cause. And so for anybody that wants to take some notes, you might number 1 to 7, because what you'll see is, first of all, he says, number 1, often, not always, there's no father in the home. And if you look at this, I have a file that's called shooting, and I have a whole section here about the fact that there seems to be a very significant link that you can find of the 27 deadliest mass shooters. 26 of them had something in common. They didn't have a father at home. Does that explain all of them? No, but it's one factor. Number 2, often but not always, the shooter has no friends or few friends and nothing resembling a real support network. Number 3, often but not always, the shooter is unemployed or barely employed. Number 4, often but not always, the shooter has a mental health issue, sometimes formally diagnosed, sometimes not. And recently I've had all sorts of people saying, that there is actually no link between mass shooting and mental health, except I find articles like this, that there's a clear link between mass shooting and mental health. Yep. Okay, so that doesn't mean everybody, but it does mean some. Number 6, often but not always, the shooter was active on extremist or Columbine-focused chat boards. We just talked about 8chan just a minute ago, and had an obsession with previous mass shootings. The shooter up there in Newtown, in Connecticut, I should say, Newport was actually involved in that regard. And then 7, often but not always, the shooter had gotten in trouble in school or been kicked out of school. And the point I'm making is those are just 7, and I've seen a few others, so you can come up with a lot of lists. Anybody that says, well, it's video games, or it's, the absence of a father at home or whatever, that's just one explanation. But if you put all of these together, it's a pretty toxic mix, and I think it maybe helps us understand a little bit more about what's taking place.
I've been sort of tracking this again, how the media responds to this. And, of course, President Trump stressed mental illness. Some other people, some Texas politicians, Governor Greg Abbott, and others sort of mentioned that. And so the media's been on a sort of a mission this past week, at least from what I've heard, to try to dispel any notion that there's a link there. And so, you and I are not mental health experts. We can only sort of know what the experts say. But the Wall Street Journal had a piece on this, and this is Dr. Torrey is founder of the Treatment Advocacy Center and author of American Psychosis. And he says in there, I'm quoting, multiple studies have done between 2000 and 2015 suggest that about a third of mass killers have an untreated severe mental illness. If mental illness is defined more broadly, the percentage is even higher. Then it goes on to say in 2018, the FBI released an investigation entitled A Study of the Pre-Attack Behavior of Active Shooters in the United States between 2008 and 2013. And it reported that 40% of the shooters had received a psychiatric diagnosis, and 70% had mental health stressors or mental concerning behaviors before the attack, which doesn't, one of the things that the mental health professionals have been trying to say is mentally ill does not mean you're going to be a mass killer. That's certainly true. But it does seem like a fair number of that mental illness plays a role in some of these, albeit if not all of them. So there's, as you point out, there's several things, but it seems like when you start highlighting some of the causes, especially if those causes don't equal gun control, then the media go to try to refute what you're saying so that it can focus strictly on gun control.
And again, you got a twofer on that one because you have a number of people, and I've received even various emails this week from people that want to be on the program trying to dispel this because they say, we don't want to stigmatize mental illness. No, we don't. And certainly I don't want to push that too far. And again, the argument that is always made is, well, that is just a small fraction. Yes, it is. I could say that, for example, let's take it out of mental health for just a minute. I can say that a very, very small fraction of young people that are addicted to violent video games ever act out. But to say that violent video games have no impact is really just being, I think most people are saying that's probably a little bit extreme. Likewise, we recognize that most people that are dealing with mental health issues, they may be depressed, or probably maybe dealing with agoraphobia. They're not even the ones that would be out there even possibly interacting with people, much less being likely to be shooters. And I wouldn't even say that people that are schizophrenic in every case pose a danger. But the reality is, as you point out, if you just look at the studies, and again, individuals that know a lot more about psychology and psychiatry than I do, and you do, certainly are saying that is a factor. It's not the only one. And you put all those mixtures together, and that's where you end up with the kinds of things that have happened in El Paso and Dayton and Gilroy and all the other places.
And we've actually been on a decades-long effort to try to mainstream mental illness, people with mental illness, so that they're back in the population, not away in institutions and so forth. And I think there's probably a lot of good that's come from that. But that also means there are people that might need to be in institutions that are sometimes out still. So I think it's a good idea to try to mainstream them as much as possible. But even by pointing that out, that connection, it sort of fights the mainstreaming narrative, and they want to push back from the industry that is involved in that.
And when you talk mental illness, it takes us to one other issue, which is kind of the hot topic these days, red flag laws.
Yes.
Okay. And so, again, you can see the difficulty. Just the other day, I was quoting from Michelle Malkin, pointing out that sometimes they will red flag individuals at the VA, and they don't even know that they have, first of all, that they have a flag on their file. Second of all, don't know that they can challenge that or have it removed. So if you play that out, you have the situation that many people have suggested is if I am an individual struggling with PTSD and I go to the VA and they figure that out, then I have virtually no chance of ever being able to get a firearm if I ever wanted to use it, even to go to a gun range. And the same kind of thing, once you open up the door to say, well, I can begin to say, I'm not so sure about what you're saying or what you wrote in your manifesto or what you posted on your social media. We could really begin to open up the door for taking guns away from individuals that actually shouldn't be denied that opportunity.
And, highlighting the red flag laws, because the media go out immediately and say, okay, what are you going to do about this? And politicians feel an awful lot of pressure, Republicans and Democrats, to come up and say, well, okay, I'll do this or I'll do that almost immediately. Legislation made in haste typically is not going to be good legislation. And so you understand that there's pressure out there. The media want to see something. Some people demand it. Understandably, the victims and the families, they want to see something done. They feel like something needs to be done. But doing it very, very quickly. And we've had people in the last two, I think Mike DeWine of Ohio the governor of Ohio introduced legislation 2 or 3 days afterwards. Have you given this a lot of thought?
No.
Senator DeWine, are you sure this is where you want to go? Have you vetted this among enough people yet? So it's just interesting to see the responses to these tragedies.
Well, again, that's the next thing I was going to talk about, because the other day we reported that the governor, DeWine, actually introduced a 17-point gun control legislation, but then when he shows up in a restaurant, he's being booed and heckled and everything like that because he's not moving fast enough.
Yeah.
Let's move to New Hampshire, because we have listeners also not only in Ohio but New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, you have Governor Sununu, I should say, and there have been people that have actually come to the state capitol and protested because there are pieces of legislation they want him to sign. And so, again, like you said, any legislation done in haste is never a good idea.
And people use this. People who've been trying to move anti-gun legislation for some time use these incidents as a catalyst. So you know, they're not excited about it, but my goodness, they see this as an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis, as Rahm Emanuel once instructed us.
Don't let any crisis go to waste, and that was his assessment and suggestion, and that's exactly what we're finding. Let's take a break. When we come back, just a couple more comments from Dr. Merrill Matthews, and then Jeremy Dys will join us as well. We'll be talking about religious liberty. We'll get an update on Medicare for all, and especially since there's still people pushing really hard for this idea of the Green New Deal. I know Dr. Merrill Matthews has read that as well and can give us a perspective on that. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do so right after this.
In each season of the television show The Bachelorette, a young woman successively sends bachelors home until she finally chooses one. This season, there was extra drama in that the Bachelorette, Hannah Brown, openly declared she's a Christian and was even shown praying. One of the Bachelor candidates, Luke Parker, is also an outspoken believer. Hannah eventually gave Luke the boot from the show after he told her he was saving sex for marriage and hoped she would not have sex with any of the contestants. Hannah rejected this idea, telling him, "I have had sex, and honestly, Jesus still loves me." "Guess what?" she said. "Sex might be a sin out of marriage. Pride is a sin, and I feel like this is a pride thing." Hannah's lack of seriousness about sexual morality is not unusual among Christian young adults today. Sure, Jesus still loves her. However, she's willfully defying Scripture. Contrast this with the seriousness with which author and former megachurch pastor Josh Harris took sexual sin in his 1997 book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. The book spawned a movement based on the idea that Christian young people shouldn't date, but should find spouses based upon family-based courtship. I interviewed Josh on the book for radio. I was skeptical of courtship dating, but I resonated with his ideas about a purity culture to help Christians respond to the influence of the sexual revolution. Years later, Josh Harris repudiated the message of the book. This summer, he left his marriage and says he's not a Christian. This is tragic. Did some people make a religion out of this purity ethic? Some did, and Josh Harris regrets encouraging that. We get purity not by refraining from sin, but through the blood of Christ, which cleanses the believer of all sin. Josh Harris once rightly stood firmly against the bachelorette culture. It appears, however, he somehow missed God's grace. I pray he finds it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention something that has surfaced in a number of different venues. So again, this is not the only place, but this is an Associated Press article entitled "Too Many Candidates, Some Iowans Tired of Massive 2020 Field." And it talks about the fact that, and they always love to tell a story of one person. So the person they talk about is Jake Porman. That's really his name, apparently. He's been trying to get every Democratic presidential candidate to sign a baseball, a souvenir of the wildest Democratic primary he's seen in 60 years. He's gathered so far 16 different signatures. And I have friends that live in Iowa. We used to broadcast in Iowa. I think this is one of the only states that in the Midwest that does not carry point of view, although I've been trying to work on that. But I've had people that live in Iowa, Dr. Matthews, that just simply say it just gets exhausting because you have 25 candidates. Mm-hmm. There are only so many Iowa state fairs, even county fairs. There's only so many diners. And so these people, after a while, first of all, are exhausted, but second of all, they're very spoiled. They expect that they should be able to talk face-to-face with every one of these presidential candidates. And this guy so far has collected 16 signatures, and before he's through, he may actually get all 25. Who knows?
Well, my wife's parents, my wife is from Iowa. My in-laws still live there. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they get the calls all the time. They simply look at the phone, and then they don't answer it most of the time because they know it's people calling to see if they're interested in doing. And of course, their small town in Iowa, Bernie Sanders went there for the 4th of July Day parade. They stayed in, but Bernie Sanders could take a small town in Iowa and go to that 4th of July Day parade, and they get inundated there in Iowa. They get so tired of it. By the end of the primaries, they're just thrilled for this to be over.
Well, and again, that's going to happen in Des Moines. It's going to happen in Waterloo. It's going to happen probably in Davenport and a few other places. But is this not maybe an indication of the exhaustion? Because you and I can probably remember 4 years ago when the first Republican debate was during this month of August. Mm-hmm. And even then we were thinking maybe that's a little premature. We will by September have had the third set of debates. And now they've raised the amount of donors you have to have. I think it's 130,000 unique donors. And you have to have, I think, 2% in 4 polls. So right now, I think 7 or 8, maybe 9 are qualified out of 25. But still, this is just exhausting, I would think, for your typical future Democratic primary voter, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're because they're going and targeting them. They're trying to get them out. When they go to Iowa, they want to have a representation at the restaurant or the community center or wherever. So they work to try to get all these people out. So it's a tiring thing. And Iowans, at least from my sense, have taken this very seriously. They're the first one up. Yeah. And so they really try to pay attention to that. It doesn't always mean that if you win the Iowa caucus, you win the election.
It doesn't. Yeah.
But it does mean it does often mean that if you poll low in that, you begin, because I think Ted Cruz won the Iowa caucus, if I remember right, and he was the one who was opposed to ethanol. That was sort of strange.
Yeah.
But you start losing donors and share and so forth very quickly then, and you're not able to continue with your campaign.
And if nothing else, just for a minute, since we're the old guys around the table, we have these millennials come in on Tuesday, and they don't realize that there was a time. Think about when John F. Kennedy ran, there were only a few primaries, and he had to kind of win one of those to even demonstrate to the party bosses in the smoke-filled rooms that he would be the good candidate in 1960. And we're talking about Iowa for just a minute. I think the person that really helped people understand how important the Iowa caucus was Jimmy Carter, if I remember right.
Right.
And so in some respects, we have created a phenomenon now where all of this is caucus and primary. And then even more recently, think of Barack Obama, because he didn't do as well in some of the primaries, but he did well enough in the caucuses and win some of the primaries that he was the nominee when everybody was sure it was going to be Hillary Clinton back in 2004.
Right. And it was at the time going back to Kennedy, you didn't really know who the candidate was going to be until the convention. I mean, things could change in the convention. So as 3 months out, 2.5 months out from the election, you could maybe in the first time that you find out when the candidate was. And they wanted to push back from that and give people more of a say. And now we've got this thing that goes on, the eternal campaign. It's just as soon as the one election's over, the next one's starting.
Yes. And I said 2004 because I was thinking about our article we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. 2004. It was 2008, obviously.
Well, actually, people were pushing her to run in 2004, but she decided.
But right. And again, that's John Kerry, because one of the things that we will talk about after the next segment is the first article, Will the 2020 election be a repeat of 2004? And that gets back to the argument that was coming from Democrats is maybe what we need to challenge George W. Bush is John Kerry, who was a little more lackluster. And are there some people now that are going to still argue that probably what we need to do is have Joe Biden? And it was interesting that Nate Silver the other day put it this way: it's not complicated, folks. Biden's going to lose the nomination if and when Democrats can become convinced that he can't beat Trump, or become convinced that someone else can. Otherwise, he's going to be your nominee. And so we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. But for looking at some of this in history is helpful, because a lot of people say that they were surprised. And I think all of us were surprised by Donald Trump. But most of the time, you can kind of see it coming. The runner-up, for example, in one particular primary oftentimes tends to be the nominee in the next one. And we've seen this time and time again in the Republican Party. We've seen it somewhat in the Democrat Party. So we'll see how it plays out this time.
Well, it is interesting because the article you're mentioning is Victor Hanson Davis, and it was a very insightful article because people tried to demonize George W. Bush, and they felt like this guy is they portrayed him as not very smart, even though he had a master's in was it business administration from Yale,
Harvard.
Yeah. You sure it was Harvard?
I am, because I went to Yale, and I know it was Harvard.
So Kerry went to Yale, right?
Yes, right.
So he had an MBA, but they tried to portray him as a dummy. John Kerry comes out as the sort of the more intellectual, thoughtful-sounding one who had an MBA or had a master's degree from Yale.
Yeah.
It turned out with a lower GPA than George Bush.
I know.
But they tried to paint George Bush, and they were just vicious against George Bush. I mean, they were vicious against him, and it turned out it just didn't. They thought it was kind of a hands down, we're going to beat him, but in fact, come 2012, a lot of us thought it was a pretty good chance to be able to beat Barack Obama because of all his problems, and it didn't happen.
It certainly didn't. And frankly, back to 2004, we'll talk about this more after the break, but one of the reasons George Bush won was Ohio, and Ohio because they had the marriage amendments and things like that. So in some respects, it was a lot closer. Of course, nobody can be any closer than 2,000, right? 530 some odd votes in Florida determined who the president of the United States would be. But again, for anybody, back to the point you made just a minute ago, that thinks that the media criticism and the Democrats' criticism of Trump is something that is new, they forget the criticism and the media reflections on George W. Bush back then.
Called him a Nazi, Bush lied, people died, and it just went on and on. It was vicious.
The only difference was George W. Bush decided not to respond. And it seems like Donald Trump is ready to respond on any particular charge. Right?
Sometimes does pre-responses.
Yes. So anyway, we're having some fun here. And when we come back, Jeremy Dys will be with us. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. We've got some articles. As a matter of fact, you can start looking at some of those. Will 2020 election be a repeat of 2004? Can you see a doctor under Medicare for all? What about religious liberty? And we have yet to even talked about whether or not there's any censorship in social media. Some people actually say there's none. It's a conspiracy theory. I don't agree. We'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition, and we certainly do welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we also have Jeremy Dys, who, of course, is the senior counsel for First Liberty. And some of the articles we've posted, one by Dr. Matthews, Can You See a Doctor Under Medicare for All? We'll get into that a little bit later. One that Jeremy wrote a while back in First Things on Trump and religious liberty. And I do want to give you a religious liberty update because there have been a number of things happening there. But guys, of course, this week we've had a couple of shootings that we've been talking about. There have been some others, but I think it illustrates how crazy it's gotten out here, because here is one article of an individual in Springfield, Missouri, comes in basically with a camouflage, body armor, military fatigues, and carrying tactical weapons. And, of course, this was walking into a Walmart, trying to sort of make a case that I'm not doing this illegally. And yet, of course, people are just terrified. And if that's not enough, somebody on the other side, a Florida man, walks into a Walmart, asks a Walmart clerk for anything that would kill 200 people. I wouldn't recommend this being the way you would want to walk into a Walmart. Wouldn't you think that, Jeremy, was maybe a really bad idea?
That's a really bad idea. And thankfully, there were good people with weapons able to stop him from engaging in any further loss of life. This week has been tragic in 10 different directions. The loss of life is at the top of that list quite clearly. And we mourn for the loss of any life, and especially those that have been taken in an innocent way, meaning they did nothing to deserve that death, and yet their lives were lost. The nation mourns at that. The response to that has also been poor, from the political stunts that are masquerading as non-political stunts by some on the left and some on the right who have fumbled a bit here as well. The reality is that we live in a fallen world in which absolutely horrible things happen. And what is laid bare this week is not only that life is deeply precious, which ought to inform us on something else in our worldview, but that government is wholly inadequate to preserve life alone.
Yes.
And wholly inadequate to fully assuage the grief that comes at the loss of life, and entirely unable to articulate why bad things happen.
Yes. Dr. Merrill Matthews, I know that one of the things you've been watching is just how the press and the media has done a poor job of covering that. And one of the articles that we'll talk about a little bit later is by Byron York. Has anyone actually read the El Paso Manifesto? I can see that you have and have survived it. And that's a good illustration as well, because a lot of what is actually in this manifesto, pretty bizarre in some respects, but it is actually, if anything, reminiscent of the kinds of things that you would have heard in some of the Democratic debates. Concerned about corporations, that sounds like Elizabeth Warren.
Yep.
Concerned about automation, sounds like Andrew Yang. Concerned about the environment, sounds like Inslee and some of the others. So it's, I think, again, an example of the press and maybe not serving us well in terms of understanding what has actually been taking place.
I would think if you were a political science teacher at the college level, you would have debates on exactly these things with people making similar points. Whether you're talking about the corporations, he feels like the corporations are pushing for low-income people to come in. I've heard that from both conservatives and from union people will say something of that nature. The environment, as you point out, he's very concerned about the environment. That typically doesn't sound like something from a conservative, which the media tend to try to paint this guy as right-wing. From the manifesto, it's not entirely clear to me that this is a right-wing thinker. And he does use a term in there which virtually no conservative uses. He calls his European comrades. That's and I bring this up because just a week ago, the Democratic Socialists of America had their annual meeting in Atlanta, I believe it is, and there they call each other comrades.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I even talked about that because there was a very good piece in one of the Heritage Foundation newsletters about what was being said there and all the rest. Well, the point I'm making is, and I think you've said this before, that when you actually pointed out that, and again, I don't want to get into this too much right now, we may get into it later, the Dayton shooter was more of a Democrat and was supported Elizabeth Warren. I think even your wife, who is married to you and probably pretty politically astute as well, said, I've never heard any of that
She
before.
had not heard any of it until I mentioned it to her. And that's the point. The media have focused on El Paso. It is a bigger, there's more people there, and it does engage some of the discussions that we've had recently about immigration and so forth. But they immediately try to paint the El Paso shooter as a conservative or at least a right-wing person. Almost nothing is being said about the Dayton thing. And I think the Wall Street Journal even had an editorial, at least in the phrase in there, should we blame Dayton on Elizabeth Warren because of that person's proclivities? And no, we shouldn't. But you can't seem to get the media to focus on these things in the ways that you would that is informing rather than creating a narrative.
Yeah. Jeremy, one of the things I've said all week is we hold the individual doing the act responsible, and some other things in the background might have an influence, but when people are trying to find a one-size-fits-all answer, whether it's fatherlessness or video games or it's something that was said by a president or a Democratic candidate, we still hold the individual that perpetrates the act responsible.
Well, indeed, there's only one actual all-answering responsibility for this whole thing. It's not just the person. It is the effect of sin and our fallenness in this world that causes these types of things to happen. And unless unless we're able to grasp that there is evil amongst us and that there is evil around us and that not all people are basically good, and that he was just a good boy that went the wrong way or had this or that influence push him in the wrong direction or had this or that friend or was hugged or not hugged enough by whatever parent, those are all maybe symptoms of a larger problem.
Right.
The foundational problem here is that we live in a fallen world that the world isn't expected to fully understand nor appreciate. But those of us who have an understanding of the truth of the gospel and that have an understanding of a worldview that says there is a good, there is an evil, ultimate on both of those sides, we need to appreciate that, need to understand that that is the problem. So that ought to move us into some other directions as well. It ought to move us to evaluate all the responses to this as well. That there is a problem here and there, and especially with the media, and especially with the political candidates that are trying to score points one way or another on this. But ultimately, it needs to be a self-introspection to say, what am I responsible for in my own life? And not nearly this bad, perhaps, but perhaps I've offended the divine being and the God in particular for something I've done.
Yeah, I think some really great insight there. When we come back, I want to talk about religious liberty, first of all, because we've posted your piece on that. I know there are some very significant actions that have been taking place. Seems like every time I open up my internet, I saw another email from First Liberty. So a lot of things have been popping, so we'll talk about that. And then one of the articles we've posted here by Dr. Merrill Matthews, Can You See Any Doctor Under Medicare for All? And that's important because that's one of those issues that's sort of front and center right now. So we'll look at some of those, and then we'll get into the whole question of what is happening right now. This one from the Associated Press. Too many candidates. Some people in Iowa are already tired of the massive 2020 appeal. And Victor Davis Hanson saying, will 2020 be a repeat of 2004 for Democrats? So we've got a lot to cover. We will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, a generation ago, driving on American roads was much safer than in many other countries with lots of open roads, like Canada or Australia. That is not the case anymore. David Leonhardt reports that our vehicle fatality rate is about 40% higher than the fatality rates in Canada and Australia. He says he was unaware of this country's outlier status until he began to report on the rise of driverless cars. As you might imagine, many people are not convinced that driverless cars will be a good thing for Americans. They aren't convinced they should trust their lives to a computer. I understand that fear, but let's remind ourselves that the current state of driving in America is very dangerous for a number of reasons. First is the problem of speed. Many other countries have lower speed limits, despite the famous German Autobahn. Small differences in speed make a very big difference in potential harm. If we install speed cameras, speeding will decline. A second reason is seat belts. I was shocked to learn that 1 in 7 American drivers do not use seat belts. Who are these people? Every time you see a person get into a car on TV or in movies, they put on a seatbelt. Most cars beep at you if you don't put on a seatbelt. A third reason is age. In other countries, 16-year-olds are often not allowed to drive. As you might imagine, teenagers are responsible for a disproportionate number of accidents. Drinking before driving is another problem, especially since many people who drink don't consider buzz driving to actually be drunk driving. And don't forget that people distracted by cell phones often are as dangerous behind the wheel as people who are drunk. Add all these factors up and you can see why driving in America is more dangerous than driving in many other countries. It's time to change our bad habits. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. And, of course, we have Jeremy Dys and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. And, Jeremy, let me come to you for just a few minutes. First of all, one of the articles we've posted, and I'll come to that in a minute, in terms of Trump and religious liberty, which I think is a very good summary of all the things that this president has done. But let's start with a news item. Many of our listeners are familiar with Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon, the sweet cakes case. And a lot of people at this point have wondered, okay, now they're kind of in limbo. They have decided masterpiece cakes a year ago. You've had the decision on the cross out of Maryland, Bladensburg. But they're still wondering, okay, where are we now with that particular case? And you've had some things that have actually taken place.
Yeah, well, remember that the Supreme Court, as you said, turned this back to the lower courts. And if you want to sound fancy at a cocktail party, you say that, or maybe a after-church chicken roast or something like that, since we're talking to a largely Christian audience here. Let's not get to cocktails here, right? Anyway, if you want to sound impressive at a party, you call it a GVR. It's a grant vacate remand. So GVR stands for grant vacate remand. So let's go through that. It says that the court granted their petition. In other words, there was something there. They didn't tell us what, but there was something there that said, okay, something needs to be done about this. They vacated the opinion below, which means that opinion at the Oregon Court of Appeals doesn't exist anymore. It's as if it was, what's his name snapped his fingers from Infinity War. Yeah. Thanos snapped his fingers and the opinion is gone. Yeah. And so that no longer exists. And so what they've said then is to say, okay, since that doesn't exist, you need to go back and do this again. This time we want you to, this is the remand part, we want you to look at the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision and see what we wrote in there, because that was before you made this decision, or this was after you made that decision. And so we want you to consider this whole case again in light of the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. Well, what does Masterpiece stand for? And this is where we start to get some insight here. It really stands for two things. Number one, people that are accused of discrimination need to have a fair trial. It needs to be a fair process. And the second thing that it said there is that the commission cannot engage in hostility towards the religious beliefs of those who have engaged in or have been accused of engaging in discrimination. Well, go through those in turn. We believe that the fair process here was anything but fair. I mean, the director of BOLI, the commissioner there, the Bureau of Labor and Industries, which we call BOLI, he said, but I think before he even got the case, he said that my goal is to rehabilitate Aaron and Melissa. Rehabilitate? I mean, that's what you do for people who are wrong, have done something incorrect. You're prejudging them. This is no longer innocent until proven guilty. It's guilty until you prove that you're not. Right, and that's a problem. That's not fair to begin with. And there are other issues that we can point out. And then the second one is, are they hostile towards the religious beliefs of Aaron and Melissa? Well, in Masterpiece Cake Shop's case, they were comparing Jack to the Nazis and Genghis Khan and calling him any number of names and bad things. What happened in Aaron and Melissa's case? Well, number one, they got a $135,000 penalty issued against them, which is the highest penalty ever issued for emotional damages at BOLI. And those are for emotional damages, $135,000 because I didn't feel good about what you did to me here, and so that may be alone to say that was ipso facto hostile towards religion. Right. But on top of all that, there were other things that went on within that proceeding as well. The order required them. It had a gag order against them. Mm-hmm. They couldn't even talk about their religious beliefs concerning marriage and this issue again in public. And I don't know what's more of an offense to the First Amendment than a gag order. I mean, you rarely put those into place, and in this case, it's a rather extreme thing to have been put in place in the first place. So just yesterday, I guess it was, I've been traveling all week, so I've lost track of my days, but it was just yesterday that we filed that new case down at the Oregon Court of Appeals. Mm-hmm. And so we're back at it now. We're trying to work hard at figuring out, okay, what happens next. We're giving our best arguments. We made some of these and many others there. You can go to firstliberty.org and read that brief on the website for Aaron and Melissa Klein. But this is by no means over, and Aaron and Melissa are living to fight another day. Sadly, we've got to fight another day, but here we are. We're working diligently to make sure that what this remand is the opportunity is providing us is well met. And so we'll hear from the other side, I'm sure, in the next couple of months, and then we'll be off to the races about argument again. Hopefully we'll get a better decision this time, but if not, we're prepared to go all the way back to the Supreme Court of the United States to say we're still not getting a fair process, and clearly they're hostile towards the religious beliefs of Aaron and Melissa Klein.
And there's some people that might say, well, I don't own a bakery, but if you own another particular business, or if you find yourself in one way or another accused of discrimination, or there have been public accommodation laws used against you, really what this is a precedent that would help you as well, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that Masterpiece Cake Shop decision is going to be very helpful to many different people and in a variety of contexts. I can't count on any number of hands, and certainly not in this room's hands, how many commissions like this there are out there in this country. Right. There are judicial commissions that govern the conduct of magistrates and justices of the peace and judges and justices as well. There are, if you have a license to do business of some sort, a legal license, whatever it might be, even the license to operate on air like you're doing right now, there's a commission, a body of some sort that is governing claims of discrimination within your industry. And these are oftentimes not filled by lawyers nor by judges, and they're certainly not filled monolithically with people from a conservative bent. Usually it's the other way around here. So my point in saying all this is that there are any number of ways for you and I as people of faith to run up against the public in a way that our faith says is different than what the world would operate by, be accused of discrimination by simply following our religious beliefs, and wind up in front of these commissions. So if that actually does happen to you, and I pray it doesn't, but if it does happen to someone listening to the show, I hope you will call First Liberty before you go into that commission. You should never go by yourself to those kinds of things. Give us a call at firstliberty.org or go to our website and help us out. We're happy to talk to you about that, and maybe we can even come to that commission hearing with you, but at least maybe we can give you a push in the right direction about what to be saying and not to say during those things, or what to be looking for. These commissions so often just simply can't help themselves. They simply have to get into what I call the reductio ad Hitlerum, right? You're going to always be reduced to a likeness of Hitler at some point within that hearing. And if that happens to you, that's patently unfair, And it is clear evidence of hostility towards your religious beliefs that needs to be challenged.
And again, if you click on the picture where Jeremy is, you will see that at the top it says Breaking Sweet Cake's Case Back in Court. So you can learn more about that. Then it has a whole section here, school, military, house of worship, community. So whatever your issue might be, you can find it there. But also the third article we've posted, Dr. Merrill Matthews, is by Jeremy on Trump and religious liberty. And I'll confess that when a lot of us saw Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we said, well, I think Donald Trump will probably be better on religious liberty, but we're not expecting much. And I think he's shocked almost all of us.
Sometimes the Lord hits a straight lick with a crooked stick. But Jeremy, in that article, highlights some of the things that were happening in the Obama administration. So he sort of mentions them, but it took me back to the struggles that we had during the Obama administration, who was actively, aggressively criticized, trying to move the needle towards more inclusivity, more transgender rights and other things, both in education and just in the general public and so forth. And so areas where you might have thought, I don't think we'll ever go there. The Obama administration was aggressively pushing us in those directions, and even turning around and saying, if you disagree with this because of some kind of religious principle, you're just really a religious bigot and you're using your religion to hide your bigotry behind. It was strong language, and Donald Trump has started to pull some of that back now.
He really has, and it all really begins back in the early days of his administration. In fact, it was not many days, over 100 days, in which he issued this memorandum calling for an opinion by the Attorney General as to religious liberty. And that's exactly what Jeff Sessions did when he was then the Attorney General of the United States. He issued a 25-page memorandum that outlined 20 different principles of religious freedom and provided also guidance for their implementation. And on top of that, they then held a day-long summit at the Department of Justice. I was there that day, and it was quite interesting to watch, quite frankly, to see a number of people come forward and say, yeah, this has been happening to me. Some of our clients, some organizations' clients that you'd be familiar with, they were there explaining what has happened to them. And there you have the Attorney General of the United States saying, we are committed to preserving your religious freedom, and we want to know more about these things. And so that sent the Department of Justice, they announced that day, as a matter of fact, that they would be sending teams into the various governmental agencies from the DOJ explaining, here's how to follow our guidance on this. You have it, right? Well, here's what it means. And that's just scratching the surface of what's been done here. You've got judges, obviously, that are a big part of preserving religious liberty in the future, have been well appointed, including one from my own firm that's now on the bench. You've got little things that may not mean a lot to the public, but mean a lot in the law. When the Solicitor General joined our side of the argument at the American Legion case, saying, yeah, basically the American Legion's right here, the full force of the United States comes on your side. That's a big help. You're no longer fending off attacks from the other side, putatively neutral to what you're doing, but undermining what you're trying to accomplish. You now have them on your side, and that's just the beginning of it all. So there's a lot that the president has done right.
And I might just mention it's the third article on our website, and I would encourage you to print it out. And if you have people saying, well, what has Trump done on religious liberty? Well, I think you're going to find quite a bit, and Jeremy's done a good job of summarizing it. We'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, one of the articles we've posted, it is our second article, Can You See a Doctor Under Medicare for All? And this is from the Institute for Policy Innovation. Of course, you've published many of these articles in a variety of different places. But there is more misinformation about this than anything else. And one of the things you mention is that in an article, it mentions that when people are told that Medicare for All, which is being promoted by a number of the Democrat presidential candidates, when they're told that Indeed, under Medicare for All, you will always have health care, even if you're fired or switch jobs. Support raises from 35% to 52%, or a majority. What you don't know is what you're going to tell us right now, and that is Medicare for All, first of all, is not Medicare, is it?
Right. When you're talking about the traditional Medicare for All proposal that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and several support, it eliminates Medicare as our listeners know it right now.
Yes.
If you're a senior on Medicare, and then we've got about 9 million people who are not seniors, have disabilities and so forth. If you're on Medicare right now, you will not be able to keep Medicare. It eliminates Medicare. So they use the Medicare for All as a marketing tool because they know that seniors tend to like their Medicare program, but you will not be able to keep the standard Medicare program as we know it right now. They create a new system, a government-run health insurance system that everybody is in the same program.
So if you like your doctor, you'll keep your doctor. No.
Well, they're saying what they're saying, and Bernie Sanders has said this. Common Dreams says that in the piece, that if you'll be able to go to any doctor, and what they're picking up on, this is bizarre, because what they're picking up on is Barack Obama's earlier statement of if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. That turned out to be PolitiFact's 2013 lie of the year, because you can't keep your doctor or your health plan. And as it turns out, people have the health insurance companies have narrowed their networks, the networks of doctors you can see, so small that people are really, really frustrated because they can't get into a plan that can see the doctor they may have gone to for 30 or 40 years, including my wife. So she went to the Medishare plan simply because she couldn't go see a doctor she's seen for 40 years. So they know that's important. Joe Biden has been coming up saying lately under his Obamacare improved plan, improved Obamacare, he's been saying you'll be able to keep your doctor. Don't trust him. But the reason they're saying that you'll be able to see any doctor is because, number one, they know that under Medicare, the large majority of doctors see people on Medicare. There's a couple of reasons for that. If you're a doctor and you're in the emergency room if you got to take care of people who are coming in, they may be Medicare. You need to be able to take that.
Right.
So most doctors do take Medicare. The large majority do. But what they don't tell you is that most doctors, I think it's probably most doctors limit their Medicare patient load.
Of course, because they don't get reimbursed as much, right?
They don't get reimbursed as much. They get on average about 20% less for Medicare than they get for health insurance. Though Bernie Sanders wants to move that to about 40 or 50% less under his Medicare for All plan. That's one of the ways he saves money to pay for the uninsured, is doctors get paid even less. But so if you're a doctor under Medicare for All, you will accept Medicare for All patients if you want to practice medicine, because there will be no private insurance. There will be, under the law, no ability for a patient to be able to pay out of pocket for something the government is paying for. So if you're a doctor wanting to practice medicine, unless it's cosmetic surgery or something like that that's just completely outside of this, you will have to take Medicare for All patients. So when they say you'll be able to see any doctor, that's probably true. There just won't be as many doctors. A lot of them will quit. But it also doesn't mean you'll be able to see them in a timely fashion.
There you go.
We know what goes on in these countries. We know what goes on in Canada. The Fraser Institute, some other groups do annual waiting lines and what happens in Canada. And for many procedures in Canada, you have to wait. You won't be able to see a doctor quickly.
Well, and again, the proposal that Bernie Sanders is talking about, which was in the debate, and the one that was contradicted in some cases by other Democrats, say you can't go out of the system. And you use Canada as a good example, because this would look more like the Canadian system where you can't go outside,
That's
whereas
right.
in UK you can. You have a woman out of Nova Scotia. That video has gone viral. Can you explain that?
You have a woman out of Nova Scotia, and the link to that to the news story is in the article. And that's actually a news story from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. That's not Breitbart, who do the story on this, but you can also find her full story on YouTube. But she did a YouTube thing where I think she's in her early 30s. She's a mother. She had cancer, and she tried to go to the doctor. Her doctor moved from where she was. Under Canada, you cannot see a specialist unless your family doctor approves it, sort of like some HMOs. And because all the doctors are overcrowded with their number of patients, if your doctor moves or retires, then you have to get in a line to get another family physician, and you can't get that physician until time opens up for them. So she waited 2 years before she could get to a family physician who could then refer her to a specialist. She tried going to emergency rooms, didn't help. They wouldn't treat her. And so now she has stage 3 cancer. She's undergoing chemotherapy and radiation. She says, I'm a young mother. I'll never be able to have children again. And she is talking to the Prime Minister of Nova Scotia, saying, you say we've got a good health care system. You come look me in the eye and tell me that. And then she tells her story. Her eye, there's tears in her eyes. It's just very moving. But it's part of the Canadian story that Bernie Sanders will never tell you.
Yes. And again, the link is on this article that we've posted there. It's the last one there. Actually, there's 6 different links. So if you want to kind of do some research, if you've been involved in a discussion, and interesting enough, that was a discussion that developed in the Democratic debates, because, you have some former members of Congress, current members of Congress that were disagreeing with the vice president, with the senators from Vermont and Massachusetts over this issue. So it isn't a settled issue, but the point I wanted to make is that oftentimes what we try to talk about here on Point of View is the need for discernment. And when you hear Medicare for all, you need to understand that, first of all, it's not Medicare. Second of all, this idea that you'll be able to keep your doctor and see him in a timely manner, maybe not.
Here's a telling thing. Last week I did a presentation at the Heritage Foundation. It was filmed by C-SPAN, and they've been running it. I know somebody called yesterday and said they were watching it. On this presentation, I present, mine's just sort of a PowerPoint presentation of news clips I've been taking from Canada and England for the last 30 years.
Yes.
And so this isn't me talking. This is the Independent, Daily Telegraph, and so forth. In both of those, so I did United Kingdom, then I did Canada. Both of them I ended with surveys from that population. So I used 2016 because after that Brexit takes over everything. But in UK in 2016, healthcare was the number 2 issue among the English people. That was their number 2 issue. Economy first, healthcare second. Go to Canada. In 2012, it was the second or third issue. In 2018, it was the number 1 issue. Healthcare system in Canada was the number 1 issue among voters in there. If it's such a great system, why is it the number 1 issue among their population?
Yeah. Jeremy, this is one example where even if you don't understand all the technical stuff, which of course Dr. Matthews does, you just simply say, as I look at what's happened in other countries, do I want that to happen here in the United States?
Oh man, it's all that's needed for me is to say, if the DMV is going to be responsible for my health care, I don't need any other argument here. But if I need any other argument, I do look to Canada and I say, yeah, not wanting that, we want to stay south of the border on this one and allow competition to have its right working here. I've actually just done myself a kind of a frustrating medical bill here. And part of what's involved with that is discerning that the medical provider here was actually a very good medical provider. The person's billing agency was less than reputable and less than ethical. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately for the medical provider, that individual is going to receive a rather strong earful to their licensing agency from the consumer, my wife and I, in this instance, at the fact that while he or she may provide good care, the way that they've administrated their business has been anything but helpful. And I actually happened to speak with another individual this morning that is connected to that procedure that has a responsibility kind of collectively with that other individual. I said, if there's anything I can do to help you to get a message conveyed to this medical personnel that that person is not being well served by this administrative process, let me know. In other words, I'm invoking the capitalistic system here. Yeah. That something has gone wrong, and I don't care how great of a physician or medical professional you are, if you don't treat people correctly, we will vote by the walking of our feet.
Yes.
And that's an appropriate way to deal with a lot of these issues.
Yeah, and that works when you have a free market, but it doesn't work very well when a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. determines which surgeries you can have, which drugs are on the formulary, and those kinds of things, right?
Right, that's right. And we have problems in our healthcare system. Obamacare did not fix them. It exacerbated the problems, and we need to fix those problems without going to Obamacare.
Yeah. We'll continue this conversation. We have a couple other things to put on the table, not to mention the fact we're in the midst of a primary season. All that coming up right after this.
In each season of the television show The Bachelorette, a young woman successively sends bachelors home until she finally chooses one. This season, there was extra drama in that the Bachelorette, Hannah Brown, openly declared she's a Christian and was even shown praying. One of the Bachelor candidates, Luke Parker, is also an outspoken believer. Hannah eventually gave Luke the boot from the show after he told her he was saving sex for marriage and hoped she would not have sex with any of the contestants. Hannah rejected this idea, telling him, "I have had sex, and honestly, Jesus still loves me." "Guess what?" she said. "Sex might be a sin out of marriage. Pride is a sin, and I feel like this is a pride thing." Hannah's lack of seriousness about sexual morality is not unusual among Christian young adults today. Sure, Jesus still loves her. However, she's willfully defying Scripture. Contrast this with the seriousness with which author and former megachurch pastor Josh Harris took sexual sin in his 1997 book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. The book spawned a movement based on the idea that Christian young people shouldn't date, but should find spouses based upon family-based courtship. I interviewed Josh on the book for radio. I was skeptical of courtship dating, but I resonated with his ideas about a purity culture to help Christians respond to the influence of the sexual revolution. Years later, Josh Harris repudiated the message of the book. This summer, he left his marriage and says he's not a Christian. This is tragic. Did some people make a religion out of this purity ethic? Some did, and Josh Harris regrets encouraging that. We get purity not by refraining from sin, but through the blood of Christ, which cleanses the believer of all sin. Josh Harris once rightly stood firmly against the bachelorette culture. It appears, however, he somehow missed God's grace. I pray he finds it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the other articles we'll probably get to in the next hour, will the 2020 election be a repeat of 2004? And also some other material that is available. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, I thought I'd come back to you for just a minute. We talked about Medicare for All. Last time we had you on the program, we also talked about the Competitive Enterprise Institute that did an evaluation of something else that has been a very significant issue right now in the Democratic presidential campaigns, and that is the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, we already mentioned that you've read the manifesto of the El Paso shooter. You've also read the Green New Deal and survived it, and it is long and detailed.
You just like taking punishment here?
I'm telling you.
I'm a glutton for punishment.
There are many good books that are much more enjoyable than what you're reading.
But you've read this Green New Deal legislation, and again, you're a stronger man than I. And first of all, let me point out that just as Medicare for All isn't about Medicare, a lot of the Green New Deal hasn't really anything to do with the environment, is it?
That's right. This is a socialist vision in the guise of a Green New Deal, of environmental concern. So what they're doing is they have racial justice, they have inequality, guaranteed jobs, a whole range of things within the Green New Deal, which are, you may agree or disagree, but it has nothing to do with the environment. But they're using all of that as a way to try to make sure that you get that you get on board with the environmental issues. So it's a utopian notion of how we're going to make it all work in less than 10 years, or about 10 years. It's bizarre. But even at that, most of the Democrats sign on to it. I mean, I think I see more Democrats hedging, Democratic presidential candidates hedging a little bit on the Medicare for all, saying let's don't go quite that far.
Right.
Let's expand Medicare to some people if they need it, but we'll keep traditional Medicare and we'll let people keep their traditional employer-based health insurance. But most of the Democratic candidates are pretty much on board with the Green New Deal, if not as vocally as some of them.
And again, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I would trust their numbers, said, okay, let's just head down this road for just a little bit and see what would be the expense for a number of states. And they look at 5 states, and 4 of those states, which are places like New Mexico and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and other places like that, they would spend in the first year $70,000. Now, you cut to the chase last time we talked about this and said, here's an easier way to remember it. That would cost more than the annual income for those families. So the average family would pay $70,000. For our listeners in Alaska, that would be $100,000. And that's because to decarbonize this economy is so expensive and also very complex, isn't it?
It's very complex. And one of the things in there is they want to go through and retrofit every building in the country. Every building in the country to make it sort of green worthy. So, there'd be huge expenses in there, and it just would not work.
Yeah. And, Jeremy, this is where, again, you don't have to look at all those numbers to simply come to the conclusion that this would be very expensive, very complex, and it really is unworkable, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just the measuring of cow flatulence alone was going to be a very difficult thing. And I guess we'd be providing new jobs in that regard, but I'm not going to be the one to volunteer to be at the south end of a northbound cow. So, I mean, that alone is a problem. But the biggest issue that I've always been concerned about in this whole process is the stated goal of the now former chief of staff to AOC saying this has never been about the environment.
There you go.
What we're after is the controls of the economy.
Right.
And that's a significant issue.
Right. And Chakrabarty, who is now left because of some of the apparently tweets that he gave about her AOC's, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Democratic colleagues. And he's a wealthy guy, as it turns out. He was a tech investor and did very well. But, he's gone on to do other things. And it's just, but having said that, the Democratic Party is moving on board with some variation of this. So it's either you're going to be all in or partly in, but that's going to be the moniker. And I think we'll see at the Democratic Convention, maybe wrong, but I think we'll see them supporting as a platform Medicare for all and some very close version of the Green New Deal as part of the platform.
Oh, I have no doubt about that at all. I think that's exactly right. And there's going to be a lot more within that platform that, given the field of 29,000 candidates that are running right now, are all going to have to be catered to some degree. And all of them are on board and seeking to signal as quickly as they possibly can how committed they are to the environment and any other virtuously signaled issue that there is out there right now that they're supposed to be catering to.
Well, let's make the list here because I like to put it together every once in a while. Medicare for all, Green New Deal, abortion until birth, free college tuition, guaranteed basic income, a living wage of $15 an hour, wealth tax, government daycare, forgive student loans, abolish ICE, that would be Immigration and Customs Enforcement, eliminate private health insurance, not everybody's on to that one, end the Electoral College, voting age to age 16, end the filibuster, pack the Supreme Court, reparations, even reparations for LGBT, and legalize illegal immigration, and those illegal immigrants would also have access to what? Healthcare?
Healthcare, absolutely.
That's the list.
California's already passed legislation to allow access to healthcare up to age 26, I think it was 21, 26 for illegal immigrants. But yes, that they will want to be able to allow everyone, and I think most of the Democratic presidential candidates essentially agreed that anybody should be able to go and get full comprehensive health care at any time when under their plan.
Jeremy, you've looked at presidential campaigns and certainly a student of history. This doesn't sound like a winning strategy to me. What about that?
Well, nuts. If it's not a winning strategy, I guess we should encourage the strategy to continue. It may not be the winning strategy to ultimately win the office, but think about how far the left has managed to move the center on things to the point now where even the right has been pulled to the left of things. We're further away than we should be even now. The last debates that we saw that being the case, that there's a clear, there was I can't remember the candidate's name now, but the gentleman from, I think, is it Maryland? The gentleman that only appeared rational that night, right? The only one that really seemed to be like, guys, you're running off of a cliff. Put the brakes on right now. And it was the one that basically raised his hand and said, how are you going to pay for this? And I think he was also the one that told Bernie Sanders not to scream at him anymore or something like that. But you get my point, where you're saying, look, stop it, right? We're going over a cliff, and you guys don't even realize it. And they're all pushing him aside and kicking his foot off the brake pedal, saying, no, we want to go over the cliff. Let us go over the cliff. Let us go. Well, that's pulling the country, and not just their party, further to the left. The more that they're able to, I used a funny example about calf flatulence earlier, but they've distracted us from how far left they've actually pulled us on this. They may not actually get to the point of measuring the impact of that type of carbon monoxide on the environment, but they're going to be able to get us, as you've now pointed out, something's going to be there. Something's going to happen at the Congress, maybe even within the Senate. Same thing with gun laws, same thing with religious liberty, abortion. You go on down the list. They've moved things entirely to the left so that now the center point, which was once deemed the far left, is now the center point.
Yeah.
And that's frightening.
You mentioned John Delaney and Tim Ryan and a few of those individuals that were saying,
tried to be a little bit voices of reason, who didn't necessarily disagree with where they ultimately wanted to go. They just felt like, how are you going to pay for this? And I've said several times, I think one of Donald Trump's best assets is how far left the Democrats are going, because a lot of moderates out there who say, Donald Trump has a lot of baggage. I don't really like that. But these people on the left, on the Democrats, they're just crazy. So that may work very well for him.
And hence my advice that we continue to enforce or enhance the strategy here and add to the list. I mean, goodness sakes, gun laws aren't really on that list as much as they should be.
I need to put that one on.
Not just simply impeach Trump because he'll be out of office, of course. They're going to have to put him in jail. So, I mean, there's more to be done here yet.
Yeah. Well, and we might even impeach a Supreme Court justice. We were hearing that the other day, too. So it just gets wilder and wilder. So when we come back, one of our articles, will the 2020 election be a repeat of 2004 for the Democrats? And also just this statement that already there are so many candidates that people in Iowa are just exhausted. And it's only August. So
I'm exhausted.
We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing, I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy Dys with us. Again, he's senior counsel with First Liberty. We have a link to that, and certainly do encourage you to check out some of that material that we've talked about this last hour. Dr. Merrill Matthews, resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. We've posted an article from each of them, but one of the first articles is by Victor Davis Hanson. I've loved him, and he's been on the program with us before, and we tend to quote from him on a pretty regular basis. An individual that is quite a student of history, of course, works at the Hoover Institute, but this one is entitled, "Will 2020 be a repeat of 2004 for Democrats?" And I thought it was kind of interesting that he actually took that issue on, because he reminds us, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that if you go back to 2003, at that time, the sitting president, was attacked as a Nazi, a fascist, a war criminal, which I guess that third one doesn't fit, but does this sound like deja vu a little bit?
Are we talking about the cake baker or George Bush?
Bush lied, people died, remember that one, all those kinds of things. There was talk of impeaching George W. Bush, and hope from the Democrats that he would have the same fate that his father had, and that is becoming just a one-term president. So in the midst of that, you had the rise of Howard Dean, but they ended up with John Kerry in the midst of that. So talk it through, because in some respects, people have said maybe what's been happening, interestingly enough, in 2020 could happen again from what happened in 2004.
It always seems to be the case that when a Republican president is running for re-election, I hear Democrats say, this is going to be so easy. This is a cakewalk. I remember that back in 1984. When somebody the person was on with Larry King Live, and he said, "Oh, I just hope Ronald Reagan runs again, because that's going to be so easy to win that election." But they tend to underestimate the person, and of course, the people they put up are often not the best candidates to challenge the ones who are there. John Kerry had a number of issues. Those came out; they were highlighted, and of course, his vice presidential candidate, John Edwards, had a number. John Edwards?
Yeah.
John Edwards had a number of issues that we found out later, and he had to end up going off into shame because of some of the things he was doing.
Yes. And Victor Davis Hanson uses some phrases, but he said that we eventually found out John Edwards was a smarmy, empty suit.
Ouch.
Ouch, indeed.
And it was a National Enquirer that exposed all that, if I remember right.
That's right. And, Jeremy, one of the things I do is every once in a while, with the old guys around the table, sometimes give a little bit of history. And it's helpful because sometimes when I look at a candidacy, you look at a campaign, you look back in what happened in the 1990s, the 1980s, and even the 1960s, you can get a little bit of an idea of how this happened. And so there's some people right now that are saying maybe the odds-on favorite might even still be Joe Biden. Nate Silver put it this way: "It's not that complicated, folks," he says. "Biden's going to lose the nomination if and when Democrats become convinced he can't beat Trump, or become convinced that someone else can. Otherwise, it might be Joe Biden." So even Nate Silver is saying things like this.
Well, yes, I guess so. But as Hansen says in his article here, and then there's 76-year-old Joe Biden, the longtime senator and former vice president. Biden, like Kerry, is an old political warhorse. For now, he poses the Democrat establishment's only safe bet. Boy, that's exactly how I want to be described in my political epitaph. I was a Democratic environment safe bet on things, and I'm not sure that he's in fact that safe of a bet, especially if the snake continues to eat its own tail, as is the political debates amongst the Democratic Party right now, going after their only safe bet with a vim and vigor that we've not seen in some time on things, because he's not far left enough on these things. So. By all means, go after the policies we were talking about earlier. By all means, yell and scream about impeachment. History does seem to have a funny way of repeating itself. Your candidate, unlike in 2004, may not have served in Vietnam. However, he has been around for every political fight since Reconstruction, it seems like, and continues to somehow hold sway within your party. I know, and I'm certain many others have not forgotten, what he did to Justice Clarence Thomas, the despicable acts that he put him through, the lies that he said to his face in those hearings and beforehand. And I think folks will quickly remember in the same manner how the left has undertaken to beat up good men like Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court and others, and how that will impact their vote. So go ahead. If this is what we're up against, then I suspect, and here's the big if word, if the president currently can keep from engaging in his own levels of, shooting in the foot, there is a good chance, there's a good path that the GOP holds the presidency going into the future.
And just historically, if you are an incumbent president running again and you have a good economy, you don't lose. The people who have lost were Herbert Hoover. He was running during the Depression, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Jimmy Carter. And if you are an incumbent president, you just almost always win if the economy's holding pretty strong. So Trump needs to make sure the economy is doing well from his standpoint. Some of the trade issues are creating a number of problems for us right now. I think that's creating some headwinds. It may be fine next year. We just don't know. But just from a historical standpoint, if you're an incumbent president with a good economy, you win.
I do want to talk about Joe Biden's gaffes in just a minute, but I want to follow up on something you've said before, because I turned it into a commentary, so you get full credit for it, and I do give you credit for that. And that is when you're Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders and you're railing against corporations, and then you think, okay, the corporation that has the largest number of people in it would be Walmart. Mm-hmm. Now, I recognize that some liberals say, well, they don't pay them enough. Okay, I got that. But I think if I go to rural America, I find a lot of people say, I'm glad we have a Walmart because I have such a great selection and low prices.
And it employs a lot of people.
Employs a lot of people, and I've got a job, which I didn't have before. Or let's take Amazon, number two, which was taking it in the neck in the last Democratic debate, and it's the second largest employer, but a lot of people saying, I don't know, $15 an hour, I get instantaneous health care benefits. They're training people now to fly drones, how to program computers, and they're not doing that out of the largesse of their heart or anything. They recognize they need a trained workforce. I'm thinking a lot of people say, I don't know, I kind of like the corporation I work for.
My wife knew a person. He was a contractor doing things and installing tubs and so forth. He got a shot at going to Amazon, set aside that job, and that was his dream job to go to because he got a steady paycheck with a good company that's probably going to be here for a long time. And almost everybody wants those jobs in their place, except New York City with AOC. So it was a great opportunity for him.
Like you said, again, if you're a Democrat right now, you're saying, well, I got to say that the economy isn't good, even when we know the economy's doing pretty well. I got to say that these corporations are evil. And of course, you can talk about, big pharma, pesticide companies, tobacco companies, whatever. But, I think a lot of people say, I kind of like my corporation. You rail against Wall Street. I want you guys to talk about this when we come back. And a lot of people say, yeah, but my 401k's in Wall Street. And if you charge them, I'm going to lose. So anyway, let's talk about that when we come back from the break. And, of course, Joe Biden's given us a few things to talk about. So we'll get into those issues right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, a generation ago, driving on American roads was much safer than in many other countries with lots of open roads, like Canada or Australia. That is not the case anymore. David Leonhardt reports that our vehicle fatality rate is about 40% higher than the fatality rates in Canada and Australia. He says he was unaware of this country's outlier status until he began to report on the rise of driverless cars. As you might imagine, many people are not convinced that driverless cars will be a good thing for Americans. They aren't convinced they should trust their lives to a computer. I understand that fear, but let's remind ourselves that the current state of driving in America is very dangerous for a number of reasons. First is the problem of speed. Many other countries have lower speed limits, despite the famous German Autobahn. Small differences in speed make a very big difference in potential harm. If we install speed cameras, speeding will decline. A second reason is seatbelts. I was shocked to learn that 1 in 7 American drivers do not use seatbelts. Who are these people? Every time you see a person get into a car on TV or in movies, they put on a seatbelt. Most cars beep at you if you don't put on a seatbelt. A third reason is age. In other countries, 16-year-olds are often not allowed to drive. As you might imagine, teenagers are responsible for a disproportionate number of accidents. Drinking before driving is another problem, especially since many people who drink don't consider buzz driving to actually be drunk driving. And don't forget that people distracted by cell phones often are as dangerous behind the wheel as people who are drunk. Add all these factors up and you can see why driving in America is more dangerous than driving in many other countries. It's time to change our bad habits. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, you know, one of the things I've said before is if we kept the microphones on during the break, you'd learn about some other things. And one of the things we were talking about is Socialism 2019. No borders, no bosses, no binaries. And matter of fact, I even had bathroom signs that were changed saying this bathroom has been liberated from gender binary. Now, I'll recognize that some of the Democrats right now are saying it's not fair that you're calling us socialists, but if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. And certainly a lot of these socialist ideas were there. And at the Socialist Conference, Jeremy, you had open borders. You had this idea of the Green New Deal. The argument that the only way we can get the Green New Deal is to have a command and control economy, which sounds like the Soviet Union, and that indeed the traditional family is reinforcing capitalism, so we need to get rid of traditional families. I think if the average American, and certainly a Point of View listener, even sat through that conference or watched one of those videos, they would just be horrified.
I truthfully don't know how the conference got anything done or accomplished on anything, because anytime they said the word many, they'd have to stop and say, I mean, cis-any, or you know, they couldn't use any words that had M-A-N in sequence with each other. You know, it was impossible. And if you, God forbid, were, you know, chatting with your neighbor, that was triggering to some others, or if you had too much perfume on or cologne on.
They had safe rooms there.
Oh, man, I tell you, it's just impossible to be able to actually get the work done. But then to top it all off by having this sort of mock show of, quote, democracy, but cloaking it in words like comrade.
Yes.
My gracious, you can't be quite serious on these things. It must just simply be, and I can't help but think, we have done a horrible job of providing education to a grand many people in this country of history.
Yes.
I am afraid to even use the word comrade in its permissible sense these days, because I just finished actually reading a book of a gentleman who volunteered to go to Auschwitz as a Polish underground individual, and ultimately escaped, but ultimately was taken captive by the occupying Russian force that came into Poland and ultimately executed as a display of their own power. I mean, this was not a good thing, and has never been a good thing anywhere it's been tried. And so you want to talk about triggering. The very fact that we have a democratic socialist idea, I think, triggers me to some degree. And I'm not entirely sure what that actually means, because it's such a silly item.
Yes.
But it's frightening that we actually have at least enough individuals that can rent out a facility, a sizable facility in Atlanta, to have an actual convention. That they have that much critical mass right now. This is something that we can laugh and wink at quite a bit, but it ought not to be given too much short shrift about.
You know, about a year ago, I wrote a piece where I went to the Democratic Socialists of America's website, and I looked at their campaign issues. And I just compared them, basically did a checklist. Democratic Socialists of America, this is what they want. Democrats, that's what, and they were virtually identical. So the Wall Street Journal put out a piece yesterday, I believe, by one of their editorial writers who went to the meeting at the Democratic Socialists of America, and points out that this is, you go to the DSA and it sounds, except for some of these a little more bizarre, but from a policy standpoint, they're pretty much on the same page as Democrats. So I think the title was, Why Aren't Democratic Socialists of America just Democrats?
Yeah. And again, my commentary was 3 days ago. And again, we do have on the archives your article, which I thought was so good, because here's what the Democratic Socialists have said, and this is what's on the Democratic platform. This time next year, we'll have a Democratic platform, and we'll be able to do a comparison. And I know there's a Dr. Merrill Matthews article coming out there for sure when that happens. And again, just if nothing else, the fact is that this is, of course, was a group of individuals that were part of Socialism 2019. But the similarities between that and some of the things we've seen in the last two debates, and the one we'll probably see in the September debate, is almost like those Venn diagrams where it almost completely overlaps.
Yeah, and the policy is an issue, and Dr. Matthews does a great job of articulating those things. But for the rest of us who aren't as articulate as Dr. Matthews is, it is appropriate to not be as polite as maybe your default is here. And I don't mean to be mean about it all, but if you see these videos of, there's one instance where someone stands up, and I'm trying to adopt their way of speaking, and it's really hard, but an individual speaks up, and all he says is, guys, point of personal privilege, guys, I really would like your help. I'm one of these people that is easily triggered by too much conversation and chatter around me and whatever. And it makes this really third grade plea to stop, confusing me. I've got a problem. And you see someone just 2 feet away from the microphone kind of erupt about it. And that person gets up to the microphone and says immediately after, point of personal privilege, can we please stop using gendered language? The individual had said guys in the general sense, and that was a gendered language. I don't know how you actually get business conducted here. Okay, but here's my point. Yeah. You see that video and you laugh at it and you say, this is ridiculous. You better be sure to share that all over the country, because that's the future we're headed to if this type of mentality takes hold in our society. It's taking hold in too many corners as it is right now, but we ought to grab that and say, look, the king has no clothes at all. Look at the nakedness here. This is ridiculous. This is silly. This is stupid. Do you want to live in a country where we've got to change every single word to cis that says man in it? I mean, it's absurd to think about these things, and it's right and appropriate for us to point out that we're inventing a new society rather than in a new way of speaking, rather than just adopting what we've always been a way of speaking. It is impossible to actually carry on a conversation in some regards anymore because of these silly new rules that are breaking every rule of grammar that most of us were taught in our own grammar schools.
And you're talking about words. How about actions? Because if you've ever seen the attempt by the president of Evergreen College to speak to the group, at one point they said you can't even use your hands because using your hands was offensive and triggering as well.
Well, did you notice in these videos too, nobody clapped. They all did the hand raised, twinkle fingers that they do there, so that no one would be triggered by the loud sound of two hands slapping together. Or interested in the sound of one hand clapping, I suppose. I mean, it's remarkable that's we used to have pity on individuals that were this
triggered,
tightly wound. I don't know what the word is, but now I think it's just simply we need to hold it up and say, do you look at this? This is silly, yes, but they're serious about it.
Yeah.
They mean it, and they want to undermine the very gender that God created you to be. This is a sincere. I mean, I know how stupid and silly it sounds, but it is an attack on our created order, and you need to treat it as such, and remind through the sense of humor that this is a problem, and if we don't correct it now in little things like this, it'll be adopted whole scale across the country.
And just a while back, we had an interview with Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the book. He's co-authored the book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And some of the statements in there are the untruths that this generation has adopted. One of those is always trust your emotions. Well, that's going to work out real well for you. What doesn't kill me makes me weaker instead of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and all sorts of other phraseology like that, which has led to this on the campus. But again, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government and society in the next. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves.
And we're going to be seeing more of it for at least for a while. And the irony is, Joe Biden is wanting to try to thread this needle because I think he sees some of the problems, and a number of commentators out there are seeing the problems. If we move this far left, even people on the left, I think Thomas Friedman sort of implied that the other day, columnist for the New York Times, if we go this far left, we probably lose and Donald Trump wins the election. But at least at this point, I don't see anything stopping them from moving farther left. I think Joe will probably adopt some of the far left stuff, try to thread the needle in a few places, but it's going to be a very liberal Democratic convention.
Yeah, I agree. They have not found the wall yet. Partly because they're for the open borders, I suppose, but they've not found where that edge is yet on their positions. And so they're going to continue to push that side of things because they ultimately, I believe, want total and complete domination of the entire society. And you're right to point out the individuals who are saying, "Whoa, I don't recognize." Alan Dershowitz, no less than Alan Dershowitz, is saying you are headed over a cliff on these things. He does not just simply not feel at home in that party anymore. He's at times working against them to say what you're doing to cake bakers and other things is absolutely absurd. It cannot stand. Ultimately, it's going to come back and it's going to cause a problem for those who think it's not causing a problem whatsoever for right now. How long that's going to take, I don't know. But the way that starts pulling back is by holding up the mirror and saying, look how silly you look like right now. And if you want to go that way, fine, but I'm going over this road. Look, I think most Americans are far too polite to do any of that thing. And that's why they're not laughing at this outright, right? But I think because of that silence, it allows that room to grow up with a willing and accommodating media to kind of bolster that this is somehow wise. But I still think that 123 Main Street believes in what you and I around this table largely, with some room, believe.
And I think they're probably rolling their eyes even if they're not laughing.
Exactly.
And there's something else maybe. We mentioned Alan Dershowitz. What about the anti-Semitism issue as well, that's surfaced? And, of course, we haven't even gotten to the Joe Biden gaffes. We'll do that right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, of course, one of the articles we posted was, of course, on the campaign. One that you could certainly read is all about what is entitled The Campaign Trail Gaffes of Joe Biden. And there are so many. So, first of all, the candidate himself, but then I want to get back to the party itself, but let's take a few of them here. As Jim Garrity says, the former vice president hit kind of a rough stretch there. Just as President Trump accidentally said Toledo when he meant Dayton, that's about the only one. But you have the vice president talking about the shootings in Houston and Michigan. At the Iowa State Fair, he said, "We choose truth over facts." But the one that I think probably has gotten the most press right now is where he was declaring that poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. These do not bode well in a woke primary, do they?
No, but they do vote well for the cartoonist out there. I remember back in, it was 1992, and George Herbert Walker Bush was running for re-election with Dan Quayle, and a cartoonist was on the Larry King talk show, and he said, I hate to say it because I don't want Dan Quayle as my vice president, but man, he is job security for us because Dan Quayle oftentimes made some slips of the tongue, and so it you at least we'd get some humor out of it. We may have a terrible country, may have some terrible policies, but at least it'd be kind of funny.
Yeah, but again, these over time do add up, and there has been something, Jeremy, that I think a lot of people have said, and that is there are many other gaffes that don't get reported. You know, if your name is Dan Quayle or Donald Trump, you get front page. If you're Joe Biden, for a while, the press has been sort of protecting him, but you're starting to see more and more saying, you know, this is just a gaffe machine, and we can't keep protecting this candidate, especially when his own rivals in the Democratic primary keep bringing them back up.
Well, we need to protect Joe Biden. I mean, we really need to protect him. He's the only safe bet for 2020. And so they really ought to do some added protection to it. Goodness sakes, how much more protection can he have? This is not his first campaign.
No.
I mean, right? We're going back to when both he and I had hair, right? I mean, we're going back a long way.
1987 was his first one.
Yes.
So he's been around for a long time. He's got an enormous record.
Neil Kinnock.
Yeah,
He's got more gaffes on both sides of the issue than people do on one side of the issue. Right, he has flipped on both sides and had gaffes on the flip side of each of these things. So he's not only contradicted himself, he's contradicted his own gaffes.
But at least he's been right on every issue because he's been on both sides at one time or the other.
Exactly.
And again, I've called this a woke primary. Now, I may be off on this, but it just seems to me that it's going to be hard given the left in nature, maybe even the influence of Socialism 2019 conference, that they don't eventually nominate Kamala Harris or somebody like that. But what are your thoughts about this? Does Joe Biden have a future or not?
Well, I mean, look, if he's been able to get away with smelling women's hairs for so long and still remaining in the primary here, this is nothing. I mean, goodness sakes, all he did was slip and let what would otherwise be considered a raging racist comment slip out of his mouth. That's nothing in comparison to what he's done in other places. I mean, he actually did engage in what could be legitimately called racism by trying to bork Clarence Thomas, for goodness sakes, and the kinds of treatment that he gave him during that hearing. I'll never forget that. So I don't think not a lot of the people will as well. So this is an elementary gap. But what it reveals again is the one-sided nature of the coverage on things. And we can complain and rail against that all we want, or accept it as a reality. I just accept it as a reality and choose to go around the many traditional uses of sources of media to the direct source itself and wait for the results for themselves to be revealed. Joe Biden has a long history from which we can draw. Most immediately as the former vice president, supporting policies that you and I would be very much opposed to. We'll go back way into his other political career as a senator and other things. It's never been one that has been greatly one that we could support. And in the areas in which we might find support, there's a certain level of insincerity in his voice and actions because of those things. I think back to when he voted in favor of RFRA. Well, he's come out now and given both barrels to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act after having voted for it, and commended Ted Kennedy for his support of the whole thing and Bill Clinton for his signing of the bill. I mean, I don't trust people who are not only on both sides of the issue, but are doing so to ensure that they retain their own power and authority. I've got a very big concern about that. And so I could just scratch him off my list as one that I could vote for because of that very fact.
One of the polls that came out this week, I think, had Joe Biden at 35%. Bernie Sanders came in second. Elizabeth Warren came in third. When you add Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who are generally considered sort of proxies, I mean, both sort of socialists, one less gaffe-prone than the other, but when you put them together, they were at 35%. And so the notion being that it may be that the Democratic Party actually does want a socialist out there or something close to it, because when you put those two, if one of them were to end up dropping out, I suspect that'll be a little while, but if those votes go to that person, Joe Biden might be beat just by the fact that there's people out there who are, when you start adding up all the others who are more closer to socialism, put several of them together, Kamala Harris in there, and then you guys actually have more support for that kind of approach than you do for Joe Biden.
Not even a single nod to Spartacus, not even one. I mean, not even a single
Cory
thought.
Booker.
Yeah, I mean, goodness sakes, at least Beto Robert Francis is polling at what, 0.01% or something?
Liz, he hadn't even made the 1%er yet, I don't think.
But his campaign is suspended, even though he's politicizing the entire shooting in El Paso. But it's a suspended campaign, at least, so he gets credit somehow for that.
You know, one of the questions people have is when will this be over? And my argument has been, and I'll see if you guys agree or disagree, that it will be over pretty quickly once you get into the primary season, because on March 3rd, you have what is kind of the Tuesday, Super Tuesday, and it's a Super Tuesday this time, because it used to be that California wouldn't vote till June, having grown up in California, and our listeners in California know that. But this time, California votes March 3rd. In addition to Alabama, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, which is going to be significant, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. A few days later, you have Louisiana, and then you have the second Super Tuesday, which is Hawaii, Idaho, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Ohio, Washington, of course, Maine. It's over by then, don't you think? And so in some respects, it tells me that any argument that people are going to make right now that you've got some dark horse like Andrew Yang is going to come out of the woodwork. No, you need name identification, you need money, and it really is down to a couple of people we just mentioned.
Well, those are two dark horses then that can possibly come out from the shadows on that. And one, I think there's a well, maybe there are two foils that are currently in the named candidates that are foils for the dark candidates. One is Marianne Williamson, who's just a wonderfully exciting person to watch. and radio personalities everywhere are grateful for her presence in the race.
I thought she did a much better job in this last debate than
It's fantastic. So you got that element of it all. But I think she may be a foil, and this sounds funny, but I do mean it seriously. Oprah Winfrey has been rumored about.
Yeah, and there's where we're going.
You have both name and funds.
Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey.
And there's number two, Joe Biden, although he desperately wants his former boss's endorsement, has not yet received it.
Yes.
And you cannot have a literal house divided in the political front. And so there is a chance that, and frankly, both of those give me great fear for the future of, well, not the country, but for the election hopes in 2020. Because I think either one of them could very easily, with a very uninformed electorate, run over any candidate that the right would put up.
Certainly could. Now, again, one of the things we recognize is in order to make those primaries, you have to generate enough names, and you have to get it working pretty quickly. But it is still something I've heard people say that the thing they fear is Oprah Winfrey, or second of all, Michelle Obama.
So let's not forget, I mean, at this time during the 2016 race, Donald Trump was... Are you kidding me? Come on, Donald Trump is good. Well, guess what? He's president now.
Well, I actually did read earlier this week that Michael Avenatti's thinking about running again.
Oh. Hallelujah. I mean, we just don't have enough crazy harebrained ideas in this country. We need one more
Harebrained ideas from Jeremy. That's I love that line, if nothing else. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, one of the other articles we've posted is "Take a Breath, America. It's Still a Decent Country Filled with Decent People" by Tucker Carlson. And it deals with two issues. Number one, we are a decent country, but I did not know until I read this that I just have to be really careful about using the number 8. Mm-hmm. And we are starting to lose perspective. And this comes from MSNBC, an individual that's a former FBI agent. I mean, you can't make some of this up. And we say this so often when we talk about some of the religious liberty stuff with Jeremy or with Kelly Shackelford. But this one just, I think, illustrates again just the craziness that is out there, even in the way in which the press is covering some of these stories. So if nothing else, I hope that you come to Point of View for hopefully a little bit of common sense. We'll talk about that right after this.
In each season of the television show The Bachelorette, a young woman successively sends bachelors home until she finally chooses one. This season, there was extra drama in that the Bachelorette, Hannah Brown, openly declared she's a Christian and was even shown praying. One of the Bachelor candidates, Luke Parker, is also an outspoken believer. Hannah eventually gave Luke the boot from the show after he told her he was saving sex for marriage and hoped she would not have sex with any of the contestants. Hannah rejected this idea, telling him, "I have had sex, and honestly, Jesus still loves me." "Guess what?" she said. "Sex might be a sin out of marriage. Pride is a sin, and I feel like this is a pride thing." Hannah's lack of seriousness about sexual morality is not unusual among Christian young adults today. Sure, Jesus still loves her. However, she's willfully defying Scripture. Contrast this with the seriousness with which author and former megachurch pastor Josh Harris took sexual sin in his 1997 book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. The book spawned a movement based on the idea that Christian young people shouldn't date, but should find spouses based upon family-based courtship. I interviewed Josh on the book for radio. I was skeptical of courtship dating, but I resonated with his ideas about a purity culture to help Christians respond to the influence of the sexual revolution. Years later, Josh Harris repudiated the message of the book. This summer, he left his marriage and says he's not a Christian. This is tragic. Did some people make a religion out of this purity ethic? Some did, and Josh Harris regrets encouraging that. We get purity not by refraining from sin, but through the blood of Christ, which cleanses the believer of all sin. Josh Harris once rightly stood firmly against the bachelorette culture. It appears, however, he somehow missed God's grace. I pray he finds it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, one of the things we've said is we hope that you will be listening to Point of View, if for no other reason to hear some things that you don't hear normally. And one of the things I talked about earlier in the week is this piece by Dennis Prager, which is entitled, "Don't Let Google Get Away with Censorship." And we've talked about some of the evidence of censorship and everything in social media and how that's well documented. There have been Senate hearings on this and all the rest. And so that comes out August 6th, which is 3 days ago. And yesterday in the Columbia Journal review, The matter of fact, the editor, Matthew Ingram, The Myth of Social Media Anti-Conservative Bias, and talks about this being one of these conspiracy theories for which there is no evidence. And this, of course, is the Columbia Journalism Review. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, Dennis Prager actually quotes a professor at Columbia University who documents, for example, that a study he did of Twitter political bias found that basically of the 22 prominent politically active individuals who are known to have been suspended, 21 of them supported Donald Trump. So can we get this Columbia University professor talk to this Columbia one? And it's just a good example of the kind of almost unwillingness to even understand what is happening in our culture today.
And it's been hard because Facebook, Twitter, these are private organizations. And so the debate has been, can a private organization, it's not a government organization, so it doesn't have to guarantee freedom of speech in the way. On the other hand, they sort of put themselves up as a utility in a way that everybody can come, and they sort of tout that. So I don't know where we're going to be. Jeremy may have a better sense on this, but it's a tough issue. But it certainly seems to me, from what I see anecdotally, that they do put more restrictions on conservative groups and things that they are doing. That Prager University, Dennis Prager mentioned in there some of the things they're doing for Prager University, Alan Dershowitz and other things that they've taken off. They pulled them down.
Yeah, Heather McDonald, Alan Dershowitz. He gives us a whole long list of, and these are 56 videos, although I heard the most recent one having to do with the Charlottesville myth. That now is 57 videos that get put on the restricted list. So it just kind of illustrates the fact that you have individuals right now and sometimes the media that are just not even aware of the issue. And so that brings us to our article here. I did not know that I have to be really careful with the number 8, because this individual there was saying that the president said we will fly our flags at half-mast until August 8th. That's 8-8. Now, I'm not going to imply that he did this deliberately, but this is an example of 8, and apparently 8 is very significant to the neo-Nazi white supremacist movement. Why? Because the 8th letter in the alphabet is H, so 8-8 would be HH, and Jeremy, that's Heil Hitler. So there you go.
Where do you begin to unpack that? I mean, I have an 8-year-old. Is he in trouble? My one son was born in 2008, weighing 8'1". I mean, he's clearly at that age a racist, right? I mean, what kind of, and just the mere language of it too. I'm not going to imply.
As you go forward,
you just did. That's the literal definition of implying something. You literally just implied that the president is a racist, and you cannot negate that with any form of the word "not" or whatever invented language you're going to create here. Perhaps there's a code that maybe the response to all this, as I sit here and think about it, is we need to create our own made-up code that the other people are violating. Yeah. Maybe we've been going about this all wrong by standing on principle and ideas like capital T truth. Maybe we just simply need to create these people have engaged in Snarfenhagen, and that's absolutely horrible. You don't know what Snarfenhagen is? Well, I mean, it's really awful stuff. And before long, people are going to believe that there's actually something called Snarfenhagen, and people are going to say, well, I'm not a Snarfenhagenist, so I'm not going to be able to support that individual anymore because I don't want to become a Snarfenhagenist myself. Well, nobody knows what that. Those words are those letters are joined together to meaninglessness. But that's what we're dealing with here, and it's hard to pin that spaghetti to the wall.
Well, I wouldn't make this implication, but I do notice that Jeremy has 6 letters in his name, and so did Hitler.
We're making this up. Well, and you have
folks,
seen.
I think the day's over on that one, right?
And you've also seen that somebody is behind. Remember when they had their fingers like this? Remember that conversation?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us that story.
Well, that was when Judge Kavanaugh was going through his hearings, and he had a lady sitting behind him, a very attractive lady, who was, I think, part of his staff or something of that nature. And she had her a finger, I think it was her left hand, was sort of in a kind of the OK sign, sitting on her lap, and the Twitter feed just exploded with she was giving a white supremacist symbol to everyone, that she's letting them know that this is white supremacist stuff. And so somebody said, well, let's just go look at her background, because she looked like she was a person of color to some extent. And she was, if I remember right, her father was a Polish Jew and her mother was Mexican, and she was born of them. And so she has sort of a Mexican appearance, but she's a product of Mexican and Jewish. And she's the one who's telling everybody that the white supremacist movement is backing him.
I was grateful for this story because I felt entirely justified having punched a lot of guys in the shoulder for making that sign, I feel very justified now that I've just been beating up on a bunch of racists in my high school days, apparently.
Well, the point I'm making is that you better start coming to Point of View just to get a little bit of common sense, and we're having fun at the expense of some of these bizarre coverages of various events.
But this is my point from earlier. You have to make fun of this.
Yes.
You have to make fun. And the reason for that is if you don't make fun of it, people believe that it's true, and it's urbane, and it's smart because they hear professors talking about it, and someone's on a TV saying these things. No, this is ridiculous, and it needs to be told to the world that it's ridiculous.
Let's send people to a couple of good websites. First of all, firstliberty.org. If you go there, on the very top, it says Breaking Sweet Cakes by Melissa Klein back in court. And that is something I would encourage you to pray about. I think if you would like to know more information about some of those various ways in which they can help you can click on School, Military, House of Worship, Community, and there's a button that says Give. And I would encourage people to also give to the ministry that you're a part of.
That's right. We've been representing Airman Melissa Klein now for, my goodness, 4 or 5 years or so. They have never received a bill from us, and we're only able to do that because people like those who listen to this show go to firstliberty.org, and by tens and 20s and multiples of it, they support the work for us to be able to go ahead and do it. We won the American Legion case because people were able to invest in us to go out and do that. I've been traveling for the last 6 business days defending religious liberty throughout the state of Texas this time because people were able to pay for my flight to do that. If we don't have those funds to do that, we can't protect religious freedom. You and I lose greater freedoms. You know how the whole thing works. So I'm grateful for those that listen to the show that do support us. Go to firstliberty.org right now and continue to do so.
IPI.org. And first of all, I might mention for our Dallas people, To the Moon, Stars, Mars and Stars. It's a great event,
right.
NASA,
and
also your articles. So talk about that.
We've got the administrator of NASA, Jim Bridenstine, used to be a congressman from Oklahoma, coming on September 13th to Dallas. And so if people are interested in that, they can certainly buy tickets to that because it'll be open to the public. And they can always go to IPI.org. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute. All our information is available free of charge, so they can go there and get on our mailing list or download whatever they want.
And again, his article, Can You See Any Doctor Under Medicare for All? I think you've heard the answer to that. We've also posted that on our website, and the link to both of those on the website, which is pointofview.net.
Which is another great organization to make sure you support, because if we don't have these airwaves, then we can't get this kind of information out to your hands.
Might also mention that even though Penna was not with us today, although we'll be seeing her in the next couple of weeks, her commentary today on Josh Harris is out. And, of course, my commentaries from this week, including the one on Socialism 2019 and a few others on the website. And so you can sign up to receive that as well. First of all, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I'm looking forward to next week. I know we've got Frank Wright and we've got Jim Dennison and a number of others, so look forward to this program next week. And again, have a great weekend. We'll see you back here Monday right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.